Europe has made itself irrelevant and powerless in the world, and President Trump has finally recognized this fact and began to act accordingly. The people who broke up the Western alliance were the people that destroyed our economy, destroyed our industrial base, destroyed our military.
Carney, the embodiment of that belief in a rules-based international order, the embodiment of the belief in net zero, the embodiment of the belief in the post-nation state, has said, well, actually, it is all imaginary.
By the time of the next election, I think the picture will be very clear. Either you vote for Nigel Farage or you get Zach Polanski.
Hello and welcome to David Starkey Talks. Today I am delighted to introduce my friend Konstantin Kisin. He's not always allowed out alone, so it's rather nice to see him. You'll all know him, of course, as the, dare I say, co-host of the wonderfully named Triggernometry. My own memories of Triggernometry, and here we can suddenly become, you're not quite an old man yet, but I am, and I'm allowed old man's reminiscences, going back to those early days of Triggernometry in an absolutely filthy and disgusting ex-pub transformed into some kind of comedy venue in Islington, where there were carpets thickened with about 6 years supply of beer spill as they adhere to the feet. All very, very different now. But we are all in, are we not, Konstantin? And we've seen it vividly in the extraordinary episodes at Davos. We're in a world that is almost as messy as that pub, in which there is a sense of a kind of detritus, of squatting in spaces that were formerly used for different things. I mean, you have made an extraordinary name for yourself, both as an observer, as a commentator, and as a kind of participant in all of this. What was your response when you saw that extraordinary, both vivid and decisive, and at the same time extraordinary rambling performance of somebody who's disrupted the world even more than you have, President Trump? What did you feel as you watched it?
Well, I imagine that and I'm not just talking about the speech that he just gave, but the speech that Mark Carney gave at Davos. I imagine that as I watch what is happening over recent months, I'm feeling very much the same things that you must be feeling as two people who've been predicting that living in cloud cuckoo land eventually ends and the reality begins to make itself known. The world we're living now, as far as I can tell, a lot of people like to personalize it to President Trump. I don't think this is really about President Trump at all. What I think this is about is the fact that Europe in particular, and we are part of it, in terms of our behavior, if not entirely geographically, has made itself irrelevant and powerless in the world. And President Trump has finally recognized this fact and began to act accordingly. And so a lot of people like to blame him for quote unquote breaking up the Western alliance. The people who broke up the Western alliance were the people that destroyed our economy, destroyed our industrial base, destroyed our military, destroyed our ability to use our force globally, destroyed our global diplomatic capital and influence around the world, and who rendered Europe powerless and useless as an ally to the United States. And we saw, if you remember, cast your mind back only a year ago, when the latest incarnation of Trump came into office, very shortly afterwards, there was a strike in the Middle East. I think it was on the Houthi base somewhere, during which some signal messages from within the administration were leaked. And the world got to see the way American leaders talk about European leaders when the world is not watching. And they called us freeloaders. And are they wrong to call us freeloaders? No, they're not. I don't know if you know this. I imagine you do. Europe is 12% of the world's population, 25% of the world's GDP, and 60% of the world's welfare spending. While at the same time, we are no longer able to make virgin steel in Britain because of the industrial and economic suicide we call net zero, rightly called net zero because it's produced net zero growth in the last 20 years since it's been pursued. And so what we are witnessing is a realist, pragmatic president of the United States who says, well, We live in a world in which no longer is following the rules. There is no appetite for the United States to remain the world's policeman, either inside of the US or outside. There are growing global centers of power elsewhere. And if Russia and China are going to pursue their own interest, we are going to pursue ours. And if you want to be on our team, you need to pull your weight. The last time he made these points, you'll remember, of course, he made them to German politicians, in which he told them that the policies that they were pursuing were making them reliant on Russian gas, which would come back to bite them. They laughed in his face. They laughed at him to his face. Of course, when Russia invaded Ukraine, they were proven right. When Germany offered the initial offer of help to Ukraine, you'll remember, was 5,000 helmets. That was that's all that they could muster. And so the realignment you're seeing now is a consequence, I think, of what we've been doing.
Let's just go back then and try and classify Trump's behavior. What you're saying in one sense is that he is little more than the boy who cried out that the emperor was naked, that Europe is naked and naked to its enemies. Is that the essential first point?
It is. I wouldn't say little more. Obviously, President Trump is a character in his own right. He has some gigantic strengths and gigantic flaws, which I think we'd all recognize. And he is acting unashamedly in what he perceives to be America's self-interest, which is what happens when the world becomes what it's become.
So in other words, what we're seeing is a Trump who is a plain speaker. He's torn. Edmund Burke talks about the decent drapery that covers realities. He's torn that decent drapery, the decent drapery of Rubis, the rules-based international order, the kind of thing that our Prime Minister, our Attorney General believe in so passionately. And he's shown that, as Mark Carney said, to go back to that second important speech at Davos, Carney, the embodiment of that belief in a rules-based international order, the embodiment of the belief in net zero, the embodiment of the belief in the post-nation state, has said, well, actually, it is all imaginary. It exists simply in the mind. It's a smokescreen. Now, let's again try and tease out a little bit of where this starts. You presented a picture that the failure is entirely or largely a European, what we can call, if you like, an Anglo-European failure. But is America really exempt? Didn't America play not simply the role of policeman, but the particular, indeed the prime author of the entire script that you describe? I mean, let's just pause. Let's just investigate. After all of what you've talked about is one face of what's called neoliberalism. Remember, the world that I grew up in transformed also radically in 1989. You are of Russian extraction. You will be profoundly aware of that fact. The world that I grew up in was kept in order, if it was kept in order at all. Yes, there was the great arena of the United Nations and the institutions created in 1945, but what kept it in order was nuclear terror, was the equal balance of nuclear terror between the two great powers of America, the United States of America, and the Soviet Union. Then, with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989, we step into this world summarized, of course. We're talking about a smokescreen. We're talking about decent draperies. Again, another word that's been used about this is a world simply of language, of nice words. Well, the great creator of these nice words, of course, is the American political scientist Francis Fukuyama. The end of history thesis that the inevitable triumph of liberalism, the inevitable triumph of capitalism, the triumph of the West, with the rest of the world lying prostrate before it and inevitably going to have to join it. But from that point onwards, I mean, it seems to me there is another development, isn't there? There's on the one hand the extraordinary triumphalism of neoliberalism, the interventions in Iraq, the interventions in Libya, in Afghanistan, the assumption that we were so powerful that we could remold the world in our image, by direct military intervention, and that we would succeed because, of course, everybody desperately wanted to be like us. The Iraqis were just absolutely desperate for the Beatles, for mini skirts, for Coca-Cola milkshakes and hamburgers, and it was the mere fact that there happened to be a few little local arrangements that a decent short war and the expenditure of a few $100 million would sort out. But America participates. America actually leads this. All the things you talked about, the wokery, the emphasis. America has deindustrialized as well. That's one of the things that Trump is on about. So the only difference, isn't it, frankly, between Europe and America isn't the question of illusion, isn't the question of stupid policy. It's the fact that the American economy happens to have survived this process better because if you believe, rather, in my view, stupidly, in absolute freedom of trade, the only person who benefits from absolute freedom of trade is the world's largest economy or the world's largest producer, which is why the British invented in the 19th century. But America is just as subject to all the forces that you talk about. They're all embedded in the Democrat Party, aren't they?
I think you make some really good points. And as you know, I've talked about the disaster that was the war in Iraq, when I think it was the end of the idea that the Western coalition is some moral force that's acting in the best interest of everybody in the world and upholding some sort of law and order and behaving decently and honorably. I agree with that. I don't quite agree with.
But we continued again in Afghanistan.
Well, Afghanistan was first, but I agree. I'm totally with you. I think the United States clearly, the war in Afghanistan, which I also was not a huge fan of, I thought was different. After 9/11, something needed to be done about Al-Qaeda. Probably not what they did. The idea, as you say, that the people of Afghanistan would be seduced by Coca-Cola or
the women were all desperate for bikinis. Yeah.
Well, the women may be desperate, but the men who are in charge may have other ideas. But so I agree with you on that front. But I would also argue, I think, just on that particular point, that if the Western coalition had remained very, very strong, even foolishness of that nature would have been survivable in the way that it hasn't been, because you can't simultaneously enforce order while making yourself weaker. If you are very strong, other people will have to contend with the reality that the Americans and the Brits will turn up and bomb you back to the Middle Ages if you don't behave. But if the Brits and the Americans talk about bombing you back to the Middle Ages but don't actually have the ability to do it anymore, that's when you're going to see the sorts of things that we're now seeing.
But of course, America has that ability. I mean, what I'm trying to get at, Konstantin,
I know,
is what is the decisive factor.
I'm about to respond, I promise you. I promise you. So I agree on much of what you say about those foreign interventions, which were foolish. I do agree. But I don't agree about some of the other stuff, because in the United States, the Democrats may have talked a very good game about green energy and net zero and all of this stuff. But really, in America, none of this stupidity ever took off. The Americans never made energy prices very high in their own country. They never ceased to produce their own energy. Yes, they deindustrialized somewhat, but that wasn't
hugely. Hugely.
But that wasn't because of net zero. That wasn't because of net zero. It's because they allowed China to trade with them freely and to make things cheaper in China, which is a process that President Trump is now reversing, because the American people understand this bit and they demand that their leaders act in a way that preserves the manufacturing and industrial capacity of the United States in a way that European electorates haven't done. The delusion in Europe is that if you continue to pursue net zero, if you talk to people about normal people in our country about net zero, most of them think it's consequence free and financially free. This is what people believe. They don't realize that when you make energy more expensive, you destroy industry and you destroy jobs. They think we're saving the planet. The Americans really, in terms of their actual policy, never pursued this with anything like the same vigor. And the third point I would make is, it's true they have a radical left Democrat Party until recently. I think that's also going to evolve over time potentially. And much of the originator ideas of all of this stupidity comes from some of those people in American colleges and universities. I agree. But in America, they also have another very powerful counterforce that has made itself known in electoral politics. President Trump, in particular, his two elections represent a huge swathe of ordinary Americans who are not prepared to tolerate this anymore. In Europe, we have not seen parties of that persuasion have anything like the electoral success that President Trump has, and therefore they have not been able to do anything about policy. And so Europe has been locked in a woke consensus, irrespective of whether that wokeness and net zero-ness and everything else came with a red rosette or a blue rosette. We've had the uniparty govern us in a way that Americans simply haven't.
So, right, this also is, I think, very important and needs emphasis. In a sense, it's a point that, again, I've been visiting in America for, oh, God knows, 50 years. It's a point that struck me when I first went to America. In many ways, America is very, very old-fashioned. It's very old-fashioned if you go to a small town. A small American town still governs itself in pretty much the same way that it did in the 19th century. You will still have the local police chief. You will still have the little local amateur fire brigade. In many ways, it's like the Kendal of my childhood, the little town in the north where I grew up, where everything is local and everything is locally run, and everything answers to the local electorate. In my little town in the north, again, we didn't have this fantasy of some huge remote fire brigade, complete with DI and whatever. It was a bunch of local lads who were called, just as they were in the little town in Maryland, where I lived for considerable stretches. 20, 30 years ago, they were called by the sound of a siren, and they all turned out. The place in America was run by a town meeting. In Kendal, it was run essentially by a group of interested and highly public-spirited local businessmen. You go to an American supermarket, it's largely stuck in the 1950s, where it's always been. And again, the American Constitution, I think, also has the effect of a degree of freezing. And I think your point about the uniparty, the fact that something changed in the nature of our politics on this side of the Atlantic. I think more extremely in Europe, with Britain itself finding itself sort of suspended between the two, as it so frequently does. But what I'm now curious about is quite how and why this happened and the American perceptions of it. I mean, I think the key moment, you talked about President Trump's visits to Europe. For me, the key moment was actually J.D. Vance in Munich, the vice president, when he effectively said, you have altered the very meaning of the word liberal and altered the very meaning of the word democracy. That, in other words, in Europe, democracy no longer means government by the majority. It means government limited by experts on the one hand, Mark Carney figures being an absolute classic example of that as the governor of the Bank of England, the kind of international bureaucracy. And then on the other hand, by legal process. And the intention is actually to stop democracy working in the name of protecting minorities. Now again, Konstantin, and there is this extraordinary paradox. America starts this stuff. America starts the critical race theory, the torment of American race relations and the over-radical solutions of the 1960s, where all this stuff begins. Now, why can you begin to suggest any ideas as to why we proved so peculiarly vulnerable to this on this side of the Atlantic? Why in particular in Britain, which of course is the originator of that structure of the American Constitution, of those American little towns that I was talking about? Why have we fallen? I mean, what is the magic of the uniparty? How, in other words, how do you think there's been some sort of surviving conservatism in America, whereas after 2010, our political development seemed to me run broadly in parallel up to about 2010. And then there is this very, very sharp divergence of pattern. I mean, everybody points out the resemblances between Clinton and Blair and whatever, the striking similarities between between Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, really striking political parallelism. And then it starts to diverge. Is it really as straightforward? I mean, the only thing I can think of off the top of my head, it really is genuinely a product of Blair's fascination with Europe and determination that we would follow the European path, where there was again that deliberate avoidance of ideological separation once you'd actually quelled communism in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. Are we really looking at this man at the new new Labour years? They do seem to be the watershed as far as Britain's concerned.
Well, perhaps, but I'm going to quote a man that I greatly admire and respect, whose friendship I've enjoyed for some time, a man called Dr. David Starkey. You may have heard of him. And one of the things I recall you saying in one of the interviews we conducted on Triggernometry, or perhaps elsewhere, in fact, maybe in a private conversation, is that one fundamental difference between the American right and the British right, and perhaps the European right more broadly, is the British right is, in particular, the British conservative movement is about preservation of tradition, whereas the American right is much more often about values which are often religiously infused. And so I think this is part of the reason that Europe reacted differently and inhaled these stupid ideas with much more vigor than the Americans themselves did, because there came a moment when we were told effectively that our past is evil. And therefore, how do you preserve something that's evil? The Americans don't quite have the same problem, because they say, well, we have our values. We have our ideas about what's right and wrong.
But the left in America say they're wicked, that the values themselves...
But that's fine. But the right in America say, no, they're not. They say our values are actually the right ones. Family, family...
But this is just going back to the survival, isn't it, of, if you like, not simply two nominal parties, but two very, very distinct approaches.
Yes.
In other words, that an election really does make a difference.
Yes. And Thomas Sowell wrote a lot about this. He's a man I enjoy reading very much, about in the book called The Conflict of Visions, in which he talks about much of this. But your point about Europe and America and the difference, I think, is critical here, which is that in Europe, once we were told that our past is evil, we then effectively lost our immune system for defending ourselves against anything. Because once people start going on TV and saying Winston Churchill, who's universally regarded as the greatest man this country's ever produced, if he is evil, which is what they were saying, and these were debates we were having 10 years ago, if you recall, and even 5 years ago, then what is the positive case that you can make? And this is one of the reasons we've got ourselves into such a pickle, because whenever I say to people, well, you keep saying, a lot of people in the British centre and on the right keep talking about the importance of British values and having immigrants coming into, I say to them, what are they? And the only thing they can come up with is, well, we stood against Hitler alone and all of this other stuff, which is all wonderful. But that isn't something that can be taken forward.
Or tolerance and diversity.
Right, and so you get... The left has an answer, which is tolerance and diversity. But the right's answer is 70, 80 years ago, which are great, wonderful things that this country and its people did. But it doesn't tell you how to live your life in the present. And so you're left in this situation where you have no answer to very powerfully articulated, guilt-creating, guilt-making arguments from the radical left, which are effectively saying your civilization is evil, and then you have no counter argument to that, which is why I think the European and British attempt to counter wokeness has been so weak, and therefore wokeness and all of this other stuff has made such huge inroads here. The other thing, of course, is, if you're not in charge, it feels like what you do doesn't matter, and therefore you might as well do whatever makes you feel good. Right? The Americans know that if they weaken themselves, the consequences will be felt immediately. But if you are Norway or Denmark or whoever, and you have lived under the American nuclear umbrella your entire modern existence, it almost feels like, well, it doesn't matter what you do because the Americans will still be there to protect you against Russia or whoever it might be that is a threat to you. So why not pursue, extreme forms of socialism? Why not pursue net zero? Why not destroy our own manufacturing, etc.?
But equally, of course, America has just elected a politician who makes any elected politician in Britain look positively moderate, hasn't it? It's elected Mandami in New York. I mean, the situation in many states, Minnesota and whatever, is quite extraordinary. I mean, I think you exaggerate the extent to which America has been immune. But let's just agree to differ on that one and move forward.
Can we just zoom in on those two examples that you gave, because I think they're quite particular. So the New York, where a lot of the radical left is coming from, has its own problems, much like the problems we've had in London until recently, when house prices are now plummeting, and perhaps it will address some of those issues. But the cost of living, you and I think, are reasonably successful, doing well for ourselves. People, I feel incredibly poor when I go to
New York. I agree.
Because it's so expensive. So the radicalism of young people in New York is a product of that specific thing that's happening in that specific city. Minnesota, totally different conversation, which is a demographic issue. If you import people from a particular place, they will bring those values with them, and if they're allowed to live in a ghetto in which they maintain those values, they will impose those values. But the rest of America has absolutely withstood the woke assault in a way that we have not.
Well, I remain a little doubtful, but there we are. Let's move on to some of the consequences. We began talking about international relations. We now find ourselves openly mocked by Trump. We are regarded, as you say, as powerless. We're in a world, are we not, in which there is, again, talking about Dr. Starkey being right. You may remember, right in the immediate aftermath of Putin's invasion of the Ukraine, I did an extended video in which I pointed out that we were manifestly stepping into the world of George Orwell, not to say particularly the world of the politics of 1984, but the geopolitics of 1984, in which there are three great powers. There's Oceania, in which Britain is airship one, there is Eurasia, and there is East Asia. And that's corresponds extraordinarily to that, and the global south below as an area to be exploited, allied with, conflicted with, and so on, and turned essentially into a service to the powers of the north. Now, we really do seem to have actually landed there, don't we? And where do the powerless fit into this world, which is essentially a return to the 19th century, isn't it? It's the great power politics of the 19th century. Great power may not like great power, but it has to respect them because they can do things. They have military strength. And those who don't, why bother?
Well, I was going to say, David, you're the historian here. You tell me, what happens when there's three great powers in the world competing for dominance and influence? What happens to the powerless? And I don't think you need to be as an eminent or as smart a historian as you are to predict what happens in that environment. It's plain, I think, for all to see that the people with no power in that situation get trampled on, as they always have done throughout every bit of history ever.
Especially, as you pointed out, that Europe is not simply powerless, but very rich, is an extraordinarily tempting tidbit for whoever wants to consume us. What do we do if you were writing a brief for an incoming British government? What would it look like? You're very good at the phrase. You're very good at, and I'm, dare I say, a very ambitious summary. What would your program look like?
I think the answer is very simple and very hard at the same time. It's very simple, but it's not very easy at all. But the number one priority of our energy policy and of our industrial policy and of government policy and anything to do with energy should be to produce as much abundant, cheap energy as we possibly can ourselves. We are in a position now, as I'm sure you know, when we import gas from Norway that it extracts from the North Sea, while at the same time shutting down our own production of gas from the North Sea. This lunacy has to end. Our attempt to save the planet, which has only raised our CO2 emissions, not lowered them, has to end. So we have to produce abundant, cheap energy, which will then lead to a reindustrialization of Britain, which also has to then be supported by tax policy. We have to cut business taxes and encourage business and entrepreneurship and industry in our country. That will get the economy growing. Then, so if it's effectively the reverse of all the three things that have been done. The things that have been done is industrial suicide, economic suicide, and cultural suicide. And what we have to do is the opposite of what's been done. So net zero is how you address the industrial suicide has happened. You cut that and you begin to make your own cheap energy and make it abundant. Cutting business taxes and getting industry and business growing in this country. And at the same time, and this partly speaks to the cultural thing, but also to the economic thing, you have to begin to address the welfare issue. An easy fix on the welfare issue is you say nobody who's a foreign national gets any benefits of any kind whatsoever. This is a policy I've been pushing to any party that would listen. The Reform, I think, have adopted this as their plan. Other than, if you turn up at A&E and you've got a broken arm, of course we'll treat you. We're a decent people. But you need to get private health insurance. And in terms of other benefits, you don't get social housing. You don't get any of that. And partly that will deal, of course, with the problem of unwanted and illegal immigration that we have, because much of it is based on the fact that you just articulated, which is we are very rich. And so people come here simply for the benefits on offer.
They freeload. They come here to freeload.
That's right. So that's the easy part. The harder part is we now have...
Careful. That involves the inversion of the values, not simply of the left, but the centre right. I mean, I
How so?
Doesn't it?
How so?
Well, and bearing in mind that the centre-right, if we believe that the Conservatives under Cameron, May, and Johnson, they're the ones. I mean, after all, the most bizarre benefit in the country that we have is a thing called universal credit. Can you imagine who created it? Ian Duncan Smith. The idea of calling a benefit universal and credit. And the mentality that displays, and indeed, if we were to investigate some of the questions that I was putting to you a little more thoroughly, why is it that the right collapsed in the way that it did? It has, in the person of people like Oliver Letwin, this extraordinary crisis of conscience after Thatcher. They actually believed all the rude things, retrospectively, all the rude things that were said about Thatcher, that she didn't believe that there was a society, she was wicked and uncaring, and Thatcherism had to be balanced by an intense sense of social involvement, social responsibility, which involves spending enormous amounts of money on the poor to try to raise the poor. So I think that you're talking now about arguing not simply with a reformed kind of Cameroon conservatism. You're talking about taking on the whole argument about the British state since 1945, arguably welfare reform from 1906, from the moralistic movements of the 19th century. I mean, do you see what I mean? There is this...
I do, but you asked me what works, and I'm telling you what works.
So right. So what? But I suppose it's really you've talked about the economy. You've talked about defence, energy policy, and so on. You haven't yet talked about the culture that presumably is the thing where finally we've got to say to people, what do you actually value? Do you want your lifestyle to be able to continue? You have to be able to persuade them that it is at risk, as you are very effectively saying that it's at risk. How would you do that? I mean, it's extraordinary. I mean, bearing in mind how long we've sailed in this particular vessel. I mean, remember, Charles Dickens, in one of his novels, has this wonderful figure. Are you familiar with Mrs. Jellyby?
Remind me.
Mrs. Jellyby is the lady who practiced telescopic charity. That's to say, she lived in squalor with her children in a mess, while she spent, this is in the 1830s, spent all her day writing letters about the condition of blacks in Africa and getting terribly, raising, this is nearly this is getting on for a couple of 100 years ago. That strand is there, and it was as prominent in the Conservative Party as it was in the Liberals and later on in the Labour Party. I mean, how do we reverse it?
Look, my view is, and I've been saying this for some time, I'm an accelerationist. I don't believe that British people will wake up to these realities until they feel these realities affecting them very directly. And the fact that they are poorer per person, per capita today than they were 20 years ago is something they are instinctively aware of and somewhat discontented by, but it's clearly not producing a credible understanding of how we got here or how we might get out of it. The fiscal crisis that I think very sensible people are predicting that is coming may be an opportunity to...
Another 1976.
Or maybe worse, because we are so big now, the IMF won't be able to bail us out. That is potentially one of the things. I obviously hope that doesn't happen, because it will be horrific for lots of people. But I also feel that we've got to a point that many people will not realize the direction of travel until we arrive at the destination. And so what I am trying to do is, from an ideas perspective, lay out the things that will need to be done when the crisis moment comes and people are looking for answers, A, to how we got here, and B, to how we get out of here. So coming back to our points about industrial policy, economic policy, and ultimately cultural policy, as you alluded to and know very well, I myself am a first generation immigrant here. I have, I think, a sensible immigration policy which welcomes people who are likely to be net contributors to our country, with whom there is likely to be cultural alignment, who are likely to behave in ways that we would approve of and will over time become British. And, you know, there's obvious examples of this, even very recently. I don't know, are you aware of any Hongkongese grooming gangs, David?
No.
Or of any Ukrainian street gangs that are robbing people in the streets of London of their phones? We can see that even significant numbers of people coming, even in a short period of time, which is not necessarily something I'm advocating for. I think we've had quite a lot of immigration, frankly. It's time to slow down. Nonetheless,
it is virtually stopping.
But it is not about the numbers of people only. It's also about who is coming in. And so what we have to do is recognize the reality. We have had, I often quote this fact, which again, I'm sure you're aware of, under Blair alone, and the Tories repeated this and did even more people came under the Blair government into this country that had come between the Battle of Hastings in 1066 and 1950. And the Conservatives...
huge, not simply more,
but hugely more. Hugely more.
It's really important we get the scale.
Yes.
The scale. It is this... But the myths are so deeply anchored. The myth of Britain as a nation of immigrants and whatever.
Well, Britain's not a nation of immigrants.
And
it's a lie. It's a thing these people borrowed from America so that they could make stupid arguments sound reasonable.
I fear taking you back to the beginning of
the but see, this is different, though, because America is a nation of immigrants. America is a nation of people who have come from other places and made it.
It wasn't to begin with. And I think it's really important, remember, that the immediate response to the gigantic immigration of the late 19th century was a complete moratorium on immigration in the earlier 20th century. Yes. And, if you like, a deliberate re-waspization of America, only torn apart in the 1960s, with consequences which are yet to be seen. Once again, it seems to me, I'm emphasizing, I think that America really is itself the origin of so many of these disasters. But let's just focus now on that cultural question. How do we go about this gigantic turning round of the huge ship?
It's super
turning
difficult.
The culture round ain't easy, is
it's
it?
Super
Are
difficult.
You perhaps think, and let me just put the immediate question. First a statement and then a question. I don't think you can do it. I don't think cultures turn round in that sort of way. I think the only reason Thatcher was able to do what she did was a combination of 1976, the fiscal crisis, of 1979, the crisis of government, the winter of discontent, and in many ways, the accident of the Falklands War. And finally, the actual great good fortune of the split on the left with the SDP factioning off from Labour. But that was Thatcher didn't change the culture as such. Thatcher changed the politics, and she changed the law. And what Thatcher did was to undo. She repealed a significant part of the legislation of the 45 government. She altered economic policy by law. She changed interest rates because then the government controlled the setting of interest rates and so on. So, are we perhaps forgetting the most centrally important point of all? We pointed to the difference that saved America is real political difference, is a real ideological difference between political parties, which offer some form of choice to the people. What we really should be talking about, Konstantin, isn't it? Can we see a new political instrument emerging in Britain that might be persuaded? Do we think that it's reform? Do we think that it's Farage, you've already mentioned, reform showing interest in the idea of benefits not being available to anybody who is foreign born? Clearly, Robert Jenrick, now having joined reform, even when he was a member of the Conservative Party, toyed with such ideas. The whole emphasis on the percentage of London housing that's inhabited by foreign families and that sort of thing. Do you see Farage in this role? Do you see reform able to embody, able to carry an electoral base, to assemble an electoral coalition that will be strong enough to embark on this extraordinary turning round of the British ship of state?
Well, there's so much to unpack there. First of all, I agree with you that changing the culture is actually the hardest thing. And that is why one of, I think, the critical things to do is to encourage through government policy the removal, voluntary or otherwise, of people that we do not wish to have in our country. I don't mean, vans turning up at people's doors and snatching them by the hundreds of thousands. I mean that the vast majority of the people we don't want in this country would leave if they couldn't get benefits in this country, actually. Let's just be honest about that, right? The vast majority.
So we alter incentives. We replace incentives with disincentives.
Correct, and that is actually, I think, something that 10 years ago would have had you called far right. Nowadays, it's centrist policy that's accepted by everybody and will be accepted by everybody. In terms of Nigel Farage and reform. I am not, I can't remember who it was that said it's a very bad idea to make predictions, especially about the future. And I stick to that fact that I don't know the future. What I would say is this, and you will be aware that there is a kind of, there's a lot of concern from people who want some of the changes we're talking about the fact that Tories are now joining reform and the kind of Toryfication of the Reform Party and so on. My view is the next election is the last opportunity we have of turning this around, for demographic reasons, if nothing else. If mass immigration and illegal immigration continues at the scale that we've had, I don't think 10 years from now, people with our views or the views that we're talking about are ever going to stand a chance of being elected in the first place, frankly. So it's the last opportunity. Now, from that pragmatic reality follow a number of obvious conclusions that I think a man of your intelligence will see, which is that there's only one party who is attempting to say anything about anything to do with the things that we're talking about along these lines in British electoral politics, and that is Reform, and that is Nigel Farage. So why is he having lots of Tories join? Well, it's obvious. I think a lot of people, our cultures are so intermeshed now with America, a lot of people start to think like Americans about British politics, which is, of course, very, very counterproductive, because Donald Trump was able to be elected with 5 or 6 people in his leadership team. Elon, J.D. Vance, Tulsi Gabbard, Vivek Ramaswamy, RFK Jr.
Scott Bessent, the key figure. The person who
yes.
actually is making Trump work is Bessent.
Yes. In Britain, you have to field 650 candidates, of whom more than 300 have to win their constituency races, which are just not remotely like what the Americans have to do. And so Nigel Farage, has to have enough people that are going to get elected in a constituency, and that means they have the infrastructure, the network, the profile, etc., etc. And he needs Tories to do that. And the other reason, of course, is once he is elected, he needs people who at least have been in government and know how it failed the first time, as Trump failed the first time, right? And so how do they then take that information and incorporate it into reform? Those are the reasons that he's doing it. So if
Careful, can I just add another one?
Of course.
And I think it is the absolute fundamental one. I suspect have toured around more reform associations than you've done.
I'm sure.
In my work with Popcom. I have a very simple trick. As you well know, you have a rather different style. I believe that one of the essences of public speaking is pantomime. You used to do it in the days when you pretended to be a comedian. But I regularly begin my appearance at a reform meeting with a confession, I have to say. I remain a member of the Conservative Party. Yes, boo, get the bugger off, And then I throw it back to them. You're smiling. It's nice. I throw it back to them and say, now, come on, I've been honest with you, you be honest with me. How many of you were members of the Conservative Party? How many of you voted Conservative? 80% of hands go up. What we've got to get over, Konstantin, is, and again, the way that reform has sold itself is profoundly misconceived. What we're seeing now is a huge realignment of British political parties. It's like what happened with the rise of Labour. Or perhaps it's more similar to the torment in conservatism following the passage of the 1832 Reform Act, the destruction of the Tory party, the whole attempt at the invention of the idea of conservatism by Robert Peel and Benjamin Disraeli's realization that Peel was far too much of a liberal actually to lead a proper conservative party. Now that sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? And what we're seeing, in other words, is a war within conservatism, which is why Jenrick has emerged in the way that he was. He was wanting, and I admit I was feeding a fair amount of advice, what he was wanting was to recognise that the Conservative Party of David Cameron had gone radically wrong. That Disraeli said, if you're to be a conservative, you have to follow, broadly what you've been talking about, the traditions of the country. Unfortunately, Cameron adopted extreme international liberalism. And that's the in other words, following directly in the footsteps of Blair. He said, I am the heir to Blair. He said, I want a Conservative Party where liberals are happy. This is an argument within conservatism, within the broad right. And the right can only win again once it is united, or at least much more united than it is at the moment. And the problem is now, isn't it, with this eternal vociferousness, we're starting to show the same vociferousness as the left. You've now got Advance. The latest council election shows Advance, the party of Ben Habib, now getting about 10%. This is ludicrous. We're group of school after group of school after group of school. And the terrible risk is, isn't it, that we are going to let the ultimate horror, which will be a Labour Green Liberal coalition in the next election. How can we begin? You and I both have degrees of influence, you much more than me. How can we begin to get this necessity for again, people chatter about a broad church conservatism. How can we get people to understand there has to be a necessary reunification? I mean, let me tell you, and I began with a joke, I'll end with a joke. I was having a discussion with a very impressive female friend of mine about all of this. And finally she said, I just can't really bring myself to vote for Nigel Farage. So I said, you mean your politics is finally determined by snobbery? And the Tory party is hanging on, isn't it, on that final snobbery? Could you really vote for that?
For now, I think, first of all, permit me, please, to disagree with you on one thing, which is I think the influence you hold is immensely greater than mine, and you're widely regarded as someone with a huge voice. So long may that continue. But from my perspective, I remember very soon after the last election being on Question Time and asking a Conservative MP who's, I don't remember, let's not even go personal on this, why they lost the last election. And he explained that in his view, they lost the last election because they went, quote, too far to the right and we lost to the Lib Dems. There is no uniting with those people.
No, agreed.
And so what is happening to the Conservative Party, and what I think inevitably will happen, if this will, I will permit myself a prediction about the future, is by the time of the next election, Reform will have probably dozens, scores of MPs who used to be Conservative MPs, because the entire Tory right will join Reform. And you already see it happening. I mean, Reform already have more MPs who are former Conservatives than native Reformers. As I like to say, the refugees are now more populous than the natives within Reform. And that will continue. And the way that...
there were no native reformers. I mean, Farage himself, if you go back far enough, was a Tory.
Sure. That's fair. I mean, from an MP perspective, there are more people who were elected as Conservatives within Reform than who were elected originally as Reformers. So how do we get people to see what you and I are saying? Well, I think the reality is that at the moment, Reform are the victims of their own electoral success, or populist, not electoral, popular success, which is, as people see that actually there's a real chance of that kind of voice being elected, people start to get ideas, whether it's Rupert Lowe or Ben Habib. And I'm sure their criticisms of Nigel in terms of his management style, etc., have some merit. I'm sure they do. But ultimately, when people see that there's an opportunity to be elected, to be the leader, to be in charge, etc., you naturally start to get some of these fractions emerging. By the time of the next election, I think the picture will be very clear. Either you vote for Nigel Farage or you get Zach Polanski. And if it is as simple as that, I think the vast majority of sensible people will choose. And that includes, by the way, we've talked this entire time about being conservatives or whatever. As you well know, I do not subscribe to those sorts of political labels myself. I regard myself as a 1990s, 2000s centrist, and that is exactly where all of my views have remained. I still believe everything I did then. And it is precisely people of that persuasion that this new coalition on the right has to win over. And that is one of the other reasons that Nigel Farage has to be seen, I think, to include some more centre-right and centrist voices, because you're going to have to win the country. You really are. And so the great thing is things are so bad that the entire country is now moving in a Reform direction. And I see it clearly. Just down the road from me, in a small town called Crowborough, there is a migrant camp, a military base actually, that is being repurposed to hold 600 male asylum seekers from the Middle East and Africa. The local town, which is full of people who elected, I think, a Green council, are up in arms, protesting every weekend, and the entire country is now experiencing this sort of thing. So come the next election, what I think will be on the table is either you vote for the only viable party that will stop the degradation and destruction of Britain, or you're going to get people who are going to continue it with even more enthusiasm than we've had today. That is your choice. And ultimately, everything else is kind of fluff.
I can think of no better note on which to end. The choice between Nigel Farage or the wonderful, fakely named Polanski. God help Britain. And thank you very much. Deeply grateful. That was, it's wonderful for Starkey to fall silent. Thank you.
That almost happened in this conversation, David.
It
almost happened, but it's always a pleasure. As you know, we've had you on Triggernometry a number of times and will again. Great admirer of your work. I'm so glad you are now a fellow YouTuber among your many other qualities and things that you do. And it's great to see you getting your voice out there unfiltered and saying what you have to say. And also, one of the other things I think is there's become this very cozy thing where people talk to each other, have each other on each other's shows, and never challenge each other or have any sort of disagreement. And actually, the fact that you and I have pushed back on each other's ideas and you've challenged me on some of my thinking has been really refreshing. So I really appreciate that, and I'm sure our audience, your audience, will have enjoyed that.
Thank you again. Great pleasure. See you soon on either your channel or mine. Your
Thanks,
place
David.
or mine.
Great to see you.
A pleasure.